My name is Brionna Bell. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my career, I've been the woman in the room people forget is listening. I work in corporate infrastructure systems, data, back-end operations, the unglamorous skeleton of a company, the part no one praises when it works and everyone blames when it doesn't. I've always preferred it that way. Quiet systems, predictable logic, clean evidence. If you met me at a board meeting, you probably wouldn't clock me as a threat. I'm measured. I don't interrupt. I don't raise my voice. I take notes instead of space. People tend to mistake restraint for passivity. They assume I'm agreeable because I'm calm, that I'm harmless because I'm polite. That assumption shaped everything that followed. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about dramatic speeches or explosive showdowns. There was no yelling, no public humiliation, no cinematic slow clap. It's about accusation. It's about what happens when someone in power decides you're the safest person to blame. And it's about what happens when that safe person understands systems better than anyone else in the room. The title of this story is simple. My boss accused me of stealing $50,000, so I pulled the server logs in front of the board. What unfolded wasn't loud. It was procedural, quiet, irreversible. By the end of that meeting, no one was shouting, but the login history traced every transaction back to his IP address. And that was enough. Before we get there, though, you need to understand who I was to them, because the accusation didn't come out of nowhere. It was the culmination of a pattern, a slow erosion of respect that I allowed, rationalized, and internalized for years. This is a story about quiet dominance, about choosing clarity over chaos, about the power of documentation. And at that moment, I realized silence is only a weakness if you don't control when it ends. I'm going to tell this honestly, not heroically, not theatrically, just truthfully. Because if you've ever been underestimated, mislabeled, or used as the most convenient scapegoat in the room, you'll understand something in this story. Have you ever noticed how the calmest person in the room is often the one everyone assumes won't fight back in the company directory? My title read Senior Systems Operations Manager. In the boardroom, I was Brionna from IT. There's a difference. To them, I was infrastructure. Background architecture. The person you CC'd when something broke. The calm voice that said, I'll look into it. And actually did? I didn't interrupt strategy discussions. I didn't compete for spotlight metrics. I didn't attach my name to wins that required teamwork. And because I didn't demand recognition, they assumed I didn't need it. My boss, Daniel, liked to introduce me as our reliable backbone. It sounded complimentary, stable, trustworthy, but the tone always implied utility, not authority. I was dependable, not influential, capable, not strategic. When quarterly presentations happened, I prepared the back-end performance summaries. I built the dashboards that made everyone else look efficient. I ensured the numbers were clean before they ever reached the board. And when someone praised our improved system reliability, Daniel would nod and say, yes, the team handled it. The team? I was the team. But I didn't correct him. It wasn't martyrdom. It was a calculation. At least, that's what I told myself. I believed that competence compounds quietly, that people notice patterns, that if I just kept delivering, the respect would eventually equal the responsibility. Instead, invisibility hardened. Meetings would end with decisions that directly impacted infrastructure, and someone would turn to me afterward, not during, and say, oh, Brionna, can we actually do that? I'd answer calmly, yes, but it will require reallocating server clusters and updating permissions. Blank stares, followed by, okay, just make it work. Just make it work. No one asked how complex it was, or how risky, or how thin our redundancy margins were becoming. They trusted that I would absorb the pressure. And I did, because competence is a trap when you don't attach boundaries to it. I was the one who stayed late when patches failed, the one who monitored weekend migrations, the one who triple-checked vendor invoices against usage logs. I built internal audit trails no one asked for, because I believe systems should protect truth even from the people running them, especially from the people running them. But none of that translated into power in the room. In performance reviews, I was described as steady, low maintenance, not political. Daniel once told me, smiling. "You're not like the others. You don't make noise." He meant it as praise. I heard it as containment. Over time, I began noticing something subtle. When issues surfaced, budget discrepancies, missed projections, operational slowdowns, the conversation drifted toward departments with less visibility. Areas where complexity could mask accountability. Infrastructure is complicated. Few executives understand it deeply. That made my department a convenient gray zone, and I was the face of it. Still, I believed integrity was armor. I believed my documentation, my transparency, and my relentless note-taking protected me. I kept meticulous logs not because I anticipated betrayal, but because I respected systems. I thought systems protected the people who maintained them. I didn't yet understand that systems only protect truth when someone is willing to surface it. To them, I was safe, predictable, unthreatening. I wasn't ambitious in a loud way. I didn't network aggressively. I didn't flatter board members. I didn't position myself as indispensable. I simply was present, precise, quiet. And that quiet became the foundation of their assumption if something ever went wrong at a scale no one wanted to claim, Brianna would handle it, or Brianna would take it. At the time, I didn't feel resentment. I felt useful, and usefulness can feel a lot like belonging until the day it becomes a liability. The first cut didn't bleed. It was small, administrative, almost forgettable. We were closing Q2, and finance had flagged a minor discrepancy, $4,200 in duplicated vendor billing for cloud storage overflow. Not catastrophic, not even unusual. It happens when automated scaling overlaps billing cycles. I had already caught it. I had documented it. I had emailed Daniel 3 days earlier with a breakdown timestamps, vendor ticket numbers, credit requests submitted, an expected reimbursement window, clean, contained. During the executive sync, the CFO brought it up casually. There was a small infrastructure overage. We're reviewing internal controls. Before I could speak, Daniel leaned back in his chair and said, lightly, "Yeah, that's on Briona's side. We're tightening it up." On Briona's side, it wasn't accusatory. His tone was relaxed, almost dismissive, as if we were discussing a misplaced receipt, but something in the phrasing lodged under my skin, because it wasn't accurate. The billing glitch originated from vendor-side latency in reporting thresholds. I had prevented it from compounding. I had solved it before it surfaced. Yet in that room, the narrative shifted subtly: infrastructure error, Brianna oversight. I didn't correct him, not because I couldn't. I had the documentation open on my laptop. One click and I could have projected the email thread, clarified ownership, reframed the situation. But I calculated the room. It was a little money. The board looked mildly annoyed, not alarmed. Challenging Daniel publicly over $4,000 would feel defensive, petty, so I stayed quiet. After the meeting, I approached him in the hallway. "Just for accuracy," I said evenly, "the overage was vendor-triggered. I sent you the breakdown earlier this week." He smiled, not dismissively, just distracted. Right. I know. I just didn't want to bog the room down in technical nuance. You handled it. That's what matters. The phrase sounded reasonable, mature, strategic, but the correction never happened. In the official follow-up memo, the language read, "Infrastructure controls are being reviewed to prevent future billing inconsistencies." Passive voice, soft blame, no villain, no clarity. And because I didn't push, the precedent was set quietly. Over the next few weeks, I noticed a shift in micro-behaviors. When finance had questions about line items, they CC'd Daniel and asked him to confirm with Brianna. When legal requested compliance logs, they addressed him first. When a board member emailed about redundancy planning, the question passed through his interpretation before reaching me. It was a subtle rerouting of authority. I was still doing the work, still solving problems, but ownership of narrative was drifting upward. And here's the part I'm not proud of. I rationalized it. I told myself leadership often absorbs communication layers, that it was efficient. Daniel shielding technical explanations from executives was part of his job. I told myself the results spoke louder than credit. But internally, something had shifted. Not anger, not yet, just awareness. Because once you notice the first small misrepresentation, you start listening more closely. I began saving meeting transcripts instead of relying on memory. I archived vendor tickets locally, even when the cloud copy sufficed. I timestamped my internal notes with more precision than necessary, not out of paranoia, out of instinct. It's strange how the body senses patterns before the mind fully articulates them. The first cut didn't bleed, but I remembered exactly where it happened. After the first small cut, nothing dramatic changed. That's how normalization works. There was no meeting where Daniel suddenly declared, "Infrastructure mistakes are Brianna's fault." No policy shift, no formal demotion of authority. It was subtler than that. It was a tone. It was timing. It was who spoke first. In executive meetings, I started noticing how often Daniel would answer on my behalf before glancing at me. Can our current servers handle the expansion into the European market? He'd pause just long enough to imply consultation, then respond. Yes, we're covered. Briona's team has been proactive. Proactive. It sounded generous, but it erased my voice from the moment of expertise. I was present, laptop open, metrics ready, but I became supporting evidence instead of a primary source. At first, I told myself it didn't matter. The information was accurate, the systems were stable, the expansion succeeded. But slowly, the pattern expanded beyond meetings. When cross-department conflicts arose, marketing demanding faster deployment timelines, product requesting resource-heavy testing environments, Daniel would reassure them without checking capacity. "We'll make it work." And then he'd forward the commitment to me with a short message. "Can you accommodate this?" Accommodate. There was never space for no, not without seeming obstructive. So I adjusted load distributions, reallocated budgets, deferred maintenance cycles. I absorbed tension into architecture. No one saw the trade-offs because I didn't narrate them. That was my mistake. I believed professionalism meant shielding others from operational strain. I believed composure meant carrying weight silently. I believed if I stayed calm, the system would remain stable. What I didn't realize was that silence can be misinterpreted as consent. There were smaller moments, too. A joke in a meeting about how IT people live in basements. Laughter. Harmless. A comment from a senior VP. "You're so steady, Briona. Nothing rattles you," said with admiration, but also expectation. Nothing rattles you. So when marketing bypassed protocol and caused a minor data sync delay, and Daniel casually said, "We'll clean that up on infrastructure's end," I didn't push back. When budget reallocation discussions shaved 10% from our redundancy cushion, and he framed it as efficiency gains, I adjusted projections quietly. When a new operations director referred to me as support instead of senior management, I corrected her privately instead of publicly. Every decision to stay composed felt mature. Every swallowed correction felt strategic. But maturity without boundaries becomes self-erasure. There's a particular exhaustion that comes from being consistently reasonable in rooms that reward dominance, from translating complexity into simplicity so others can shine, from choosing harmony over visibility. And because I never reacted emotionally, the narrative solidified. Briona is fine with this. I wasn't fine. I was observant. I began tracking patterns more intentionally, not just technical logs, but conversational ones. Who deferred to whom? Who interrupted whom? Whose ideas were rephrased and credited elsewhere? It became data, and the data told a story. I was becoming the silent stabilizer, the fallback, the department where accountability could blur without immediate resistance. Still, I stayed, because leaving felt dramatic, because speaking up felt disproportionate to the slights, because none of it, individually, justified confrontation. That's how normalization traps you. Not through one catastrophic event, but through dozens of manageable ones. Each instance small enough to tolerate. Each compromise is defensible, until the accumulation becomes an infrastructure of its own, invisible, load-bearing, and dangerously underestimated. Looking back, I can see that I wasn't being disrespected loudly. I was being repositioned quietly, and I helped build the framework that allowed it. It took me a while to realize that in every organization, there's an unspoken casting process. No one announces it. No one writes it down. But roles get assigned beyond titles. There's the visionary, the closer, the political navigator, the firefighter, and then there's the stabilizer. I was the stabilizer. Reliable, measured, always prepared. The one who wouldn't escalate unnecessarily. The one who wouldn't embarrass leadership by contradicting them in public. The one who would stay late without announcing it. the one who could be trusted not to make things messy. It sounds honorable. It isn't always, because the stabilizer becomes the emotional shock absorber for everyone else's ambition. When product overpromise, I adjusted infrastructure timelines. When did finance underestimate scaling costs? I found internal efficiencies. When did Daniel commit to deliverables without full system assessments? I recalculated capacity models quietly and redistributed workloads so the promise wouldn't break. I became the quiet insurance policy behind bold leadership, but insurance policies are rarely thanked unless disaster strikes. And even then, people say, good thing we had coverage, not good thing she built that coverage. One afternoon, during a cross-functional strategy session, I saw the role crystallize. The board wanted aggressive expansion into a new SaaS vertical. It required rapid onboarding infrastructure and higher data processing thresholds. Risky, if rushed. I laid out the technical realities calmly. We can support it, but we'll need phased deployment. Otherwise, redundancy margins drop below our safety threshold. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. Then he turned to the board. We'll take the phased approach internally, but from a messaging standpoint, we're full speed ahead. Internally, messaging standpoint, translation will publicly move fast and privately rely on Brianna to prevent fallout. The room was approved unanimously. Afterward, as we walked out, Daniel clapped me lightly on the shoulder. That's why we have you. You make big moves safely. I smiled, but something about that phrasing lingered. Not you lead big moves, not your design strategy. You make them safe. I wasn't seen as the architect of expansion. I was seen as a guardrail, and guardrails are only noticed when they fail. The more I observed, the clearer the pattern became. When praise was distributed, it flowed upward and outward. When responsibility was diffused, it drifted sideways and sometimes downward. Infrastructure was complex enough to obscure causality. Few people in leadership truly understood server authentication flows, API request tracking, and billing log reconciliation. That knowledge asymmetry placed power in my hands, but because I didn't weaponize it, they assumed it was neutral. They assumed I was neutral. What they didn't realize was that neutrality is often a conscious choice. I could have interrupted, corrected, claimed space. There were moments where asserting myself would have been justified, even necessary, but I was still operating under an internal belief competence will eventually equal influence. I hadn't yet accepted that influence often requires visibility, and visibility requires discomfort. By that point, my notes had become more detailed. I documented meeting commitments line by line. I stored approvals. I archived Slack threads where the scope shifted subtly, not because I was preparing for battle, but because I was beginning to understand the role I'd been assigned. Reliable, useful, invisible. And invisibility is convenient until someone needs a shadow to place blame in. I didn't yet know how literal that would become, but I felt the structure tightening, like beams settling before a storm, and I began asking myself a quiet question. If something significant went wrong tomorrow, who would the room instinctively look at? I didn't like the answer. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen during a crisis. It happened on a Tuesday at 7:40 p.m. under fluorescent lighting while most of the office had already gone home. I was reviewing routine server performance metrics. Nothing unusual. CPU loads are within the threshold. Database response times stable. Authentication logs are clean. It was quiet in the way only corporate buildings can be quiet: air conditioning humming, distant elevator chimes, the faint glow of monitors reflecting off glass walls. That's when I saw it. A permissions override. Small, technical, buried inside a cluster of routine administrative adjustments. At first glance, it looked authorized. The change had executive-level credentials attached to it. Temporary financial access clearance to back-end billing reconciliation logs. Unusual, but not impossible, except that the timestamp didn't align with any scheduled audit, and the access duration was longer than standard protocol allowed. I leaned back in my chair and pulled the deeper logs. Every system tells a story if you know where to look. IP routing history, device fingerprinting, multi-factor authentication checkpoints, internal token refresh intervals. It wasn't a breach. It was internal. Someone with executive privileges had accessed billing controls directly bypassing the usual finance review process. I didn't panic. I didn't assume wrongdoing. I assumed curiosity. Maybe finance had requested something off-cycle. Maybe Daniel had approved a special audit. So I checked the email logs. Nothing. no documentation, no request trail. I closed my laptop for a moment and just sat there. This was the first time I felt it not irritation, not dismissal, but vulnerability. Because infrastructure logs don't care about hierarchy. They record behavior without narrative. And the behavior I was seeing didn't align with the process. I could have escalated immediately. I could have emailed Daniel that night. Hey, I noticed an override. Just confirming context. But something stopped me. Not fear, clarity. For the first time, I didn't rush to stabilize. I didn't rush to protect the organization from potential internal friction. I simply observed. I reopened the logs and exported a clean copy to my encrypted archive. Standard practice during anomaly reviews, quiet, routine. Then I went home. That night, I didn't sleep well, not because of the technical irregularity, but because of what it symbolized. Up until that moment, I had believed that while narrative power drifted upward, operational integrity remained intact, that even if I wasn't credited, the system itself was honest. But if executive credentials were being used without documentation, that meant the system's transparency depended entirely on my willingness to illuminate it. And I realized something uncomfortable. I had more leverage than I had ever acknowledged. Not emotional leverage, not political, structural leverage. The next morning, nothing felt different in the office. Daniel joked about weekend plans. Finance discussed quarterly forecasts. The board prepared for an upcoming strategy review. No alarms, no tension, just normalcy. But internally, something in me recalibrated. I stopped thinking of myself as the stabilizer. I started thinking of myself as the archivist. Because archives don't argue, they reveal, and revelation doesn't require volume, it requires timing. I didn't know yet what the permissions override meant. It might have been harmless. It might have been procedural laziness. But I made a quiet decision that morning. From this point forward, I would no longer absorb risk without record. Silence would still be my posture. But it would no longer be automatic. It would be deliberate, and deliberate silence is different from passive quiet. One is erasure, the other is preparation. That Tuesday night was the first time I chose preparation. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't change my tone. But I stopped being naive about the structure I was holding up. And once you see the structural weak points, you can't unsee them. That was the day something shifted. Not externally, internally. And internal shifts are the ones that matter. After that Tuesday, I didn't behave differently. That was intentional. If someone had observed me from the outside, they would have seen the same Briona. Calm in meetings, precise in reports, agreeable when timelines tightened, steady when departments clashed. But internally, my silence had changed categories. Before, it had been instinctive. Now, it was strategic. There's a subtle power in choosing not to react immediately, in allowing people to continue believing the version of you that benefits them. Daniel still answered questions on my behalf in executive sessions. I let him. He still committed infrastructure resources before checking with me. I nodded and adjusted. Finance still filtered technical questions through him first. I responded with the same professional tone. Nothing about my demeanor suggested tension. But I was watching more closely. The permissions override I had noticed wasn't a one-time anomaly. Over the next month, there were 2 more instances of executive-level access to billing controls without documented audit trails. Small amount internal transfers between cost centers, reclassifications. Each one is technically explainable. Each one is undocumented. And every time, the login credentials trace back to the same executive account. Daniel's, I didn't assume intent. That's important. In infrastructure, correlation doesn't automatically mean malice. Sometimes leaders explore systems without understanding the implications. Sometimes shortcuts are taken under pressure. But the pattern was forming, and patterns are harder to dismiss than events. What changed in me wasn't suspicion, it was posture. When Daniel casually said in one meeting, "We've had some minor back-end reconciliation noise lately," but Briona's tightening controls, I didn't feel the usual urge to correct him privately. Instead, I simply noted the phrasing in my notebook. Minor noise, Briona tightening. Language matters, especially when it repeats. Silence, when chosen, becomes data collection. I began preparing weekly internal summaries, not for distribution, just for myself, clean exports of authentication logs, timestamp server access histories, version-controlled documentation of billing thresholds and override privileges. Everything encrypted, everything organized. Not dramatic, not paranoid, methodical. The more I documented, the calmer I felt. Because clarity removes fear, and fear is what keeps most people reactive. There was a moment during a leadership dinner where Daniel laughed and said, "Briona's the least confrontational person here. She'd never throw anyone under the bus." The table laughed lightly. I smiled. He wasn't wrong historically, but what he didn't realize was that I don't throw people under buses. I pull records into daylight. That month, the board scheduled a full quarterly financial review, a deeper dive than usual. External auditors present, line item reconciliation across departments. When the calendar invite hit my inbox, I felt something settle into place. Not excitement, alignment. Because if there were inconsistencies in billing controls, that would be the environment where narrative and data intersected. And narrative without data is just opinion, but data presented calmly, that's something else entirely. Daniel continued to operate as if nothing had shifted. He delegated confidently. He spoke about infrastructure fluidly. He positioned himself for strategic oversight. And I let him, because the more comfortable someone feels in a narrative, the less guarded they are about it. Silence had stopped being survival. It had become an observation. Others mistook it for weakness. They always do. They assume that the person who doesn't interrupt lacks conviction. That is the one who doesn't escalate, lacks leverage. But leverage doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. And I was no longer absorbing risk to protect comfort. I was preserving clarity for the moment it would matter. No one noticed the difference. That was the point. Preparation doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. That was the advantage. After I made the internal decision to stop absorbing risk blindly, I didn't start acting like an investigator. I didn't request special access. I didn't ask suspicious questions. I simply used the access I already had more thoroughly. As Senior Systems Operations Manager, my credentials included full visibility into authentication logs, server-side financial reconciliation triggers, permission escalation histories, and back-end audit archives. Most executives didn't even know those layers existed in detail. They assumed IT had logs. They didn't understand the granularity. Every login has a fingerprint. Every action leaves a timestamp. Every override writes a trail. Most people never look at those trails unless something breaks. I started looking before anything broke. I built a mirrored archive of sensitive system activity completely within policy. No hacking, no hidden software. Just automated exports configured to preserve original metadata in secure storage. Clean, unaltered copies. If someone ever questioned system integrity, I wanted an untouched reference point. I also reviewed financial workflows end to end. Not to accuse, just to understand pressure points. I mapped how a billing adjustment moved from vendor invoice to internal ledger to executive dashboard, where approvals were required, where they could be bypassed, where documentation was optional versus mandatory. What I found wasn't catastrophic. It was flexible, too flexible. The system trusted the executive credentials implicitly. If someone at Daniel's level reclassified expenses or adjusted internal cost center allocations, the change was registered as authorized by default. No alert, no escalation, just a line item. And in an organization scaling quickly, small internal transfers rarely raised alarms. Over the next 6 weeks, I watched subtle reallocations occur, always under threshold levels that would trigger automatic review. $8,500 here, $12,200 there. Never dramatic, never round numbers, and always tied to Daniel's login history. Still, I didn't jump to conclusions, because here's the thing about quiet dominance: it isn't fueled by emotion, it's fueled by patience. I cross-referenced timestamps with meeting calendars, with vendor negotiations, with performance bonus cycles. Patterns emerged. Some adjustments aligned suspiciously close to quarterly reporting cutoffs, moments where departmental performance metrics were scrutinized heavily. Cost overruns in one division would quietly shift into infrastructure allocations before financial snapshots were finalized. On paper, infrastructure spending looked volatile. Other departments looked efficient. If you didn't know the back-end mechanics, you'd assume my department lacked control. And Daniel oversaw infrastructure, which meant narrative insulation for him. I didn't feel anger when I realized this. I felt clarity, because clarity removes the emotional fog that clouds action. The accusation hadn't happened yet. The public blame hadn't been spoken, but I could see the scaffolding forming. If at any point someone examined high-level financial reports without drilling into log-level granularity, the infrastructure would appear messy, inconsistent, prone to irregularities. Convenient. That's when I stopped thinking defensively and started thinking structurally. I organized my documentation into 3 categories: authentication trails, raw login data, IP addresses, device IDs, transaction histories, billing adjustments, cost center reallocations, override permissions, timeline correlations, cross-reference dates between financial shifts and executive reporting cycles. Everything labeled time-stamped, duplicated in secure storage. I didn't alter anything. That's important. I never changed a log, never edited a record. My leverage wasn't manipulation. It was preservation. In meetings, nothing about me suggested awareness. I still brought the graphite mechanical pencil, still wrote notes neatly in the margins, still spoke softly when asked direct questions. Daniel remained comfortable enough to make one critical mistake a month later. But before that mistake, there was a board session scheduled to review financial anomalies. And for the first time in my career, I didn't walk into that session as the stabilizer. I walked in as the archivist. They never noticed the difference. They thought I was quiet. They didn't realize I was ready. The board session was scheduled for a Thursday morning. On Tuesday night, 2 days before it, the number appeared, $50,000. It wasn't labeled dramatically. It wasn't highlighted in red. It was embedded inside a batch of internal reallocations, stacked among smaller figures that mirrored the pattern I'd been tracking for weeks. But this one was different. It wasn't under threshold. It wasn't subtle. It was bold. A $50,000 transfer routed from a departmental budget adjustment into an infrastructure cost center, flagged as a temporary reconciliation hold. Temporary. There was no corresponding vendor invoice, no procurement ticket, no documented approval, just executive credentials and a timestamp 11:47 p.m. I didn't react emotionally. I reacted procedurally. First, I exported the raw transaction log, then the authentication trail, then the IP routing metadata, device signature, 2-factor authentication confirmation. All intact, all clean. The login history traced every transaction back to his IP address, Daniel's home office network, not the corporate VPN pool, not a shared executive device. His private connection. I stared at the screen for a long time, not because I was shocked, but because of what it meant structurally. This wasn't ambiguity. This wasn't flexible accounting. This was direct, traceable, executive-level financial manipulation routed through infrastructure. And infrastructure meant me. The realization settled slowly if this surfaced without context. The narrative would write itself. Senior Systems Operations Manager fails to control back-end billing integrity. $50,000 missing from infrastructure oversight. The board would not initially see IP addresses. They would see departmental irregularity. And Daniel oversaw the department, but I ran the systems. That was the position I had been assigned. Reliable, useful, invisible, and replaceable. I leaned back in my chair and allowed myself 1 full minute of stillness. No panic. No rehearsed confrontation. Just clarity. I opened my archive timeline correlations and placed this new transaction into context. The pattern now had escalation. Previous reallocations had padded performance metrics ahead of board reporting. This one occurred days before a comprehensive financial audit. Too large to be a coincidence. Too traceable to be an accident. I didn't email anyone. I didn't alert finance. Instead, I built something simple. A clean, linear report. Not accusatory, not editorialized. Just a sequence. Timestamp. User authentication ID. IP address origin. Transaction ID. Cost center impact. Absence of approval documentation. I saved it as a secure presentation file. Then I did something important. I created a second version of the report without conclusions. Just raw logs. Because evidence should be undeniable without interpretation. That night, I didn't sleep much, but not from anxiety, from recalibration. Up until this point, my preparation had been defensive. Insurance? Now it was directional. The board meeting agenda included a line item titled Infrastructure Budget Variance Review. Variance? That was the word they would use. And I knew exactly what the variance contained. Wednesday afternoon, Daniel stopped by my office casually. Board's going to push on infra volatility tomorrow, he said lightly. They're seeing swings they don't love. I looked at him calmly. I can walk them through the transaction history. He hesitated. Just slightly. No need to get into weeds. High-level reassurance should be fine. High-level reassurance, of course, because high-level narratives protect ambiguity. Detailed logs dissolve it. I nodded. Understood. He smiled and left. That was the moment I understood the full architecture of what had been built. The small cuts, the normalized deflection, the narrative positioning. It had all prepared the ground for this, a significant financial discrepancy parked inside infrastructure, days before the audit, with leadership already framing volatility as my department's instability. I didn't feel betrayed. I felt confirmed, because clarity removes self-doubt, and self-doubt is the last tool someone in power relies on when positioning a scapegoat. I closed my laptop and placed my graphite pencil neatly on top of my notebook. The next morning, I would walk into the boardroom with two versions of the truth. One summarized, one raw, no drama, no raised voice, just documentation. For the first time in my career, I wasn't preparing to stabilize. I was preparing to reveal, and revelation doesn't require aggression. It requires precision. The night before the board meeting, I sat at my dining table with my laptop closed. Not because I had more work to do, but because I had a decision to make. There were three clear options in front of me. Option 1, say nothing, present a high-level explanation of infrastructure volatility, accept partial blame for process gaps, tighten controls publicly, and handle the discrepancy quietly with Daniel afterward. That would preserve my position, maintain harmony, keep the narrative intact. It would also cement the role I had been slowly cast into. Option 2, confront Daniel privately before the meeting, show him the logs, give him the opportunity to self-report or correct the transfer before the board ever saw it. That would feel ethical, direct, professional. It would also give him time to craft a counter-narrative, because once someone knows what you know, strategy shifts. Option 3, bring the raw logs into the boardroom and let the data speak for itself without warning. Not as an ambush, as clarification. Each option carried risk. Silence meant complicity. Private confrontation meant unpredictability. Public documentation meant irreversible consequence. I wasn't thinking about revenge. I was thinking about integrity. The question wasn't, what will protect me? The question was, what protects the system? Because the truth is, financial manipulation inside back-end infrastructure doesn't just affect reputation, it affects trust, investor trust, employee trust, and structural trust. If executive credentials can quietly reroute $50,000 days before an audit without documentation, that's not a personal conflict. That's governance failure, and governance failures don't resolve quietly in hallways. They are resolved in records. I replayed the hallway conversations, the phrasing, the subtle distancing, the high-level reassurance should be fine. I realized something important. If I confronted him privately, I would be stepping back into the stabilizer role, cleaning up something I didn't cause. Again, and if I stayed silent, I would be accepting the narrative that infrastructure volatility originated from oversight, not manipulation. The only option aligned with my moral code documentation over drama was the third, but choosing it meant accepting fallout, because once data enters a boardroom, it can't be unheard. Reputations shift, power dynamics recalibrate, and even if I remained composed, the act itself would redefine me, not as the quiet support, but as the person willing to surface the uncomfortable truth. That carries a cost. I closed my eyes and asked myself a simple question. If this story were told 5 years from now, which version of me could I respect? The one who preserved comfort, or the one who preserved clarity? The answer wasn't emotional. It was structural. The next morning, I placed 2 flash drives in my bag, one labeled Infra-Variant Summary, the other unlabeled containing the full authentication and transaction logs. I wore the same charcoal blazer I always wore to board meetings. Same silk blouse, same graphite pencil. Nothing about my appearance suggested escalation. That was intentional, because confrontation without heat disarms defensiveness. I wasn't going into that room to accuse, I was going into that room to answer. And if the answer happened to trace every transaction back to his IP address, then the system would correct itself. Not through anger, through evidence. I locked my apartment door and headed toward the office with a strange sense of calm. The decision had been made, and calm, once chosen, is unshakable. The boardroom always felt colder than the rest of the office. Not physically, structurally. Long walnut table, frosted glass walls, dual monitors mounted at either end. Carafes of water are placed with quiet symmetry. It was a room designed for decisions, not emotions. I arrived 10 minutes early, not to rehearse, to observe. Daniel was already there, speaking with the CFO in low tones. He looked relaxed, comfortable. His laptop is open, slides prepared. When he saw me, he gave a brief nod. "Ready?" he asked casually. "Yes," I said, and I meant it. The meeting began the way they always did: financial overview, growth metrics, projections, polished slides, confident language, strategic framing. When the agenda shifted to infrastructure budget variance review, Daniel took the lead. "We've seen some volatility in back-end allocations," he began smoothly. "Nothing alarming, primarily reconciliation timing issues. Brianna's tightening controls." There it was again, tightening controls. The board members glanced at me with mild expectation, not suspicion yet, just curiosity. The CFO added, "There's a specific $50,000 reconciliation entry we'd like clarity on." Specific. The word landed gently but carried weight. Daniel turned toward me, giving the floor with a small, almost generous gesture. "Brianna can walk us through it." I stood, connected my laptop to the display, and opened the summary file first. Calm, measured. "This is a linear breakdown of the variance entry," I said. "Timestamp Tuesday at 11:47 p.m., labeled as temporary reconciliation hold with an infrastructure cost center." I clicked to the next slide. No corresponding vendor invoice, no procurement ticket, no documented finance approval. The room grew quieter, not tense yet, but attentive. Daniel shifted slightly in his chair. I continued. "In reviewing back-end authentication logs, I traced the executive credentials used to initiate the transaction. I paused not for drama, but to transition. Then I opened the second file. Raw logs filled the screen. Columns of timestamps, user IDs, and IP addresses. No graphics, no interpretation, just system truth. For clarity," I said evenly, "the login history traced every transaction back to his IP address." I zoomed in on the metadata: device signature, two-factor confirmation, private residential IP origin, Daniel's home office. Silence is a physical thing in rooms like that. It compresses. No one spoke immediately. The board chair leaned forward. "Whose credentials are those?" I didn't look at Daniel. I looked at the screen. "They belong to Daniel's executive account," I said. No accusation in my tone, no emphasis. Just confirmation. Daniel inhaled sharply. "There must be some mistake. That doesn't make sense." I nodded slightly. "The logs are direct exports from the authentication server. They're unedited. I've included IP routing verification and device fingerprinting." The CFO's eyes were scanning quickly now. "Are you suggesting unauthorized access?" "I'm suggesting the transaction did not originate from infrastructure operations," I replied calmly. "It originated from executive-level credentials outside the documented approval workflow. The phrasing mattered. Not you did this, but the system recorded this." Daniel attempted to reframe. "I was reviewing departmental allocations late that night. It may have been a temporary placeholder." The board chair's voice remained even. "Why was there no documentation?" No one looked at me anymore. They were looking at him. I stepped back from the screen slightly, hands relaxed at my sides. I had not accused, I had answered, and that was enough. The rest unfolded procedurally. Request for internal audit review, temporary suspension of credential privileges pending investigation, legal consultation scheduled. No shouting, no spectacle, just consequence. As the meeting adjourned, Daniel avoided my eyes. I packed my laptop carefully, slid the graphite pencil into my notebook, and walked out of the boardroom at the same measured pace I always had. From the outside, nothing about me had changed, but inside that room, the architecture had shifted permanently. Silence had moved, and this time, it wasn't mine. The aftermath didn't explode. It unraveled. By the end of that Thursday, Daniel's executive credentials had been temporarily restricted pending an internal audit. Not revoked, just limited. Officially, it was framed as procedural review. Unofficially, everyone understood what it meant. When power is questioned in a boardroom, it doesn't recover quietly. Friday morning felt different in subtle ways. Conversations lowered when I walked into shared spaces not out of hostility, but recalibration. People were adjusting to new data. The CFO requested a full infrastructure audit, not because she distrusted me, but because documentation demands completeness. I handed over everything I had archived, Clean, organized, indexed. There was no scrambling, because I had already done the work. By Monday, patterns emerged under formal review. The $50,000 wasn't isolated. It was simply the most visible instance. Smaller reallocations across prior quarters surfaced under scrutiny. Nothing criminal yet, but ethically unstable. Daniel maintained that the transfers were temporary strategic reallocations intended to smooth reporting optics. His language remained polished, controlled. But optics is a dangerous word in financial governance. The board placed him on administrative leave pending investigation. That's when the emotional consequences began. Not for me, for him. Because absence creates awareness. Without Daniel filtering conversations, departments began reaching out to me directly. Finance requested clarification without mediation. Product asked capacity questions in real time. And something interesting happened. They realized I wasn't volatile. Infrastructure wasn't unstable. The volatility had been narrative. Numbers, when viewed without repositioning, were consistent. For years, cost fluctuations had been artificially introduced and then framed as operational noise. Once that layer disappeared, the data smoothed. No one said it directly, but they saw it. Meanwhile, Daniel's influence evaporated with startling speed. Invitations disappeared from his calendar. Executive Slack channels grew quiet around his name. Power is sustained by perception. Once perception fractures, authority drains quickly. There were no public statements, no dramatic town halls, just a controlled internal memo announcing temporary leadership restructuring. I was asked to serve as interim head of infrastructure reporting directly to the board's operations committee. Not as a promotion, as stabilization. The irony wasn't lost on me. But this time, the stabilization was transparent. In the weeks that followed, the audit concluded that executive-level reallocations had distorted departmental performance metrics over multiple reporting cycles. While not classified as embezzlement, the behavior violated governance policy. Daniel resigned before formal disciplinary action was finalized. His departure email was brief, vague, pursuing other opportunities. There was no mention of logs, no mention of $50,000. Systems don't write farewell messages. People do. I didn't feel triumphant when I read it. I felt quiet relief, not because he was gone, but because the truth had surfaced without distortion. The organization recalibrated quickly, new approval workflows implemented, executive override alerts activated. Billing adjustments now require multi-level documentation. Controls tightened, not because I demanded it, because the system demanded it once revealed. The most interesting consequence wasn't structural, though. It was relational. Colleagues who once filtered conversations through Daniel now looked at me differently. Not fearfully, respectfully, not because I had exposed someone, but because I had remained calm while doing it. There's a particular credibility that comes from restraint paired with precision. And once established, it doesn't fade easily. The consequences had begun, and they weren't loud. They were permanent. There's a moment in every unraveling when someone realizes it won't reverse. For Daniel, that moment came 3 weeks after the board meeting. He requested a private conversation, not in the boardroom, not in a formal setting, just a quiet conference space on the 17th floor, glass walls, neutral carpeting, the kind of room used for performance reviews, and soft exits. I agreed, not out of obligation, out of closure. When he walked in, he didn't look angry. He looked smaller, not physically energetically. Authority has weight, and without it, posture changes. I never meant for it to escalate like this, he began. I let the silence sit. He continued. The reallocations were temporary. I was smoothing reporting optics. Everyone does it to some extent. I thought I could move it back before the audit. Before the audit. That phrase said everything. Intent wasn't the issue anymore. Timing was. You could have told me, he added, almost accusingly. You could have flagged it privately. There it was, the last attempt to reposition responsibility. I met his eyes calmly. I flagged the transaction in the board meeting when it was on the agenda. That's not what I mean, he said. Frustration creeping in. You blindsided me. Blindsided. I considered the word carefully. For months, I said evenly, infrastructure volatility was attributed to my department without full context. I documented what the system recorded. I didn't interpret it beyond that. He exhaled sharply. You knew what that would do? Yes, but not in the way he meant. I knew it would clarify the source. I replied, that's all. Silence settled again. What he was really asking wasn't why I presented the logs. He was asking why I didn't protect him. Why didn't I absorb the risk? Why I didn't stay in the role assigned to me, reliable, useful, invisible. He leaned back in the chair, looking at the ceiling briefly. Do you feel good about how this turned out? It wasn't a challenge. It was almost a plea. I thought about it honestly. I feel steady. I said, the controls are stronger now. The reporting is accurate. That matters. He studied me for a long moment. I underestimated you, he said quietly. It wasn't an apology, but it was the truth. Yes, I replied gently. You did? There was no heat in it, no satisfaction, just confirmation. He nodded once, as if accepting something irreversible, because that's what had happened. The board's confidence had shifted. Governance structures had tightened. His resignation letter was already filed. Even if he wanted to reverse it, explain it differently, he couldn't. The logs existed, the timeline existed, and once evidence becomes institutional memory, narrative control evaporates. When the meeting ended, he extended his hand. Professional, measured, I shook it. No bitterness, just finality. As he walked out of the conference room, I didn't feel victorious. I felt lighter. Not because someone fell, but because I had finally stepped out of a role that required me to hold other people's decisions silently. It was too late for him to fix it, but it wasn't too late for the organization to recalibrate. And it wasn't too late for me to redefine who I was in that room. That mattered more than anything. The final confrontation wasn't the one in the 17th floor conference room. It happened a month later, during my first formal board review as interim head of infrastructure. This time, I wasn't seated halfway down the table with a laptop open and notes ready. I was at the center, not elevated, not glorified, just positioned differently. The board chair opened the meeting by acknowledging the governance updates. New multi-level approval workflows, automated executive override alerts, transparent reconciliation logs are accessible to both finance and infrastructure. Briona, she said, walk us through the changes. I stood, connected my laptop, and began calmly, this is the revised authentication structure. I explained, executive credentials no longer bypass billing documentation requirements. All cost center reallocations above $5,000 trigger automatic cross-department notification. Slide by slide, I outlined the structural improvements, no references to Daniel, no references to the $50,000, just systems. When I finished, one of the board members, an older investor, who had rarely spoken directly to me before, leaned forward. Why weren't these controls in place earlier? It wasn't accusatory. It was evaluative. I answered honestly. The previous structure relied heavily on executive discretion. It assumed alignment between authority and documentation. We've shifted from trust-based overrides to system-based verification. No blame, no defensiveness, just an explanation. The board chair nodded slowly. And you're confident this prevents recurrence? Yes, I said, because it removes ambiguity. Overrides can still happen, but they can't happen invisibly. That word lingered in the room. Invisibly? For a moment, I wondered if anyone connected it to the broader narrative, not just financial, but relational. I didn't need them to. The structural shift was the point. After the formal session ended, a few board members lingered. Casual conversation, light questions about scalability and long-term infrastructure resilience. The tone toward me had changed. It wasn't warmer. It was clearer. I wasn't Briona from IT. I was the person who understood the system deeply enough to protect it even from executive misuse. There was one brief moment near the end of the meeting that felt like quiet closure. The CFO approached me privately and said, "You handled that situation with more restraint than most would have." I considered that carefully. "I handled the data," I replied. "The rest handled itself." She smiled slightly. "That's not entirely true. Timing matters. Maybe it does. But timing without evidence is noise." I didn't raise my voice in any of those rooms. I didn't send dramatic emails. I didn't expose anything beyond what the logs already held. That was the confrontation. Not heat, not humiliation. Just documentation placed in front of the authority without distortion. And the most powerful part, no one could argue with it. Because you can challenge the interpretation, you can challenge intent, but it's very difficult to challenge time-stamped authentication logs tied to a private IP address. Especially when they're projected calmly in front of the board. That was the confrontation. And it never required anger. It's been a year since that board meeting. I no longer introduced myself as from IT. I introduced myself as head of systems governance. The title changed formally 6 months after Daniel's resignation. The board voted to separate infrastructure operations from executive financial discretion permanently. What began as interim stabilization became structural leadership. But the external promotion isn't the most meaningful shift. The real change happened internally. For years, I believed quiet competence would naturally evolve into influence, that integrity would speak for itself without amplification, that if I simply did the work well enough, recognition would align with responsibility. I don't believe that anymore, not because integrity doesn't matter, but because visibility and integrity must coexist. I still don't raise my voice in meetings. I still take notes with the same graphite mechanical pencil. I still pause before responding to questions. But I no longer allow others to narrate my department's reality for me. If a financial fluctuation occurs, I explain its origin directly. If someone mischaracterizes infrastructure capacity, I correct it in real time. Calmly, not defensively, just accurately. What surprised me most over the past year wasn't how others changed. It was how quickly I stopped feeling the need to shrink. There's a subtle difference between humility and self-erasure. I used to blur that line. Now I don't. When new executives join the company, I walk them through governance architecture personally. I explain why executive override alerts exist. Why is cost center transparency automated? Why no credential, mine included, operates without traceability? And I say it plainly, systems protect organizations best when they protect them from everyone equally. No one laughs at that. No one treats it as overkill. Because the lesson is institutional now, I don't harbor bitterness toward Daniel. Bitterness requires emotional attachment. What I feel instead is clarity. He underestimated me because I allowed a pattern of underestimation to persist. I mistook silence for strategy long before it actually became strategic. Now my silence is intentional. If I pause in a room, it's because I'm choosing timing, not because I'm deferring. If I let someone speak first, it's because I'm gathering information, not because I lack conviction. And if documentation ever needs to surface again, it will, not as retaliation. As a structure, sometimes people ask quietly if I was afraid that day in the boardroom. I wasn't, because by the time I projected those logs, fear had already dissolved. Fear exists when you're unsure of your footing. I had built mine carefully. The person I am now isn't louder. She's anchored, not invisible, not reactive, just aligned. And alignment is a form of power that doesn't require display. I still believe in calm rooms. I just make sure I'm not mistaken for quiet compliance inside them. That's who I am now. When people hear this story, they usually focus on the $50,000. The accusation, the boardroom reveal, the login history traced back to his IP address. But that's not the heart of it. The heart of it is this. For a long time, I confused being calm with being invisible. I believed that if I stayed reasonable, absorbed tension, and protected everyone else's comfort, I would eventually be protected in return. That's not how power works. Power respects clarity. It respects documentation. It respects the person who can remain composed while presenting an undeniable truth. I didn't win because I exposed someone. I didn't rise because someone fell. I changed my position because I stopped volunteering to hold narratives that weren't mine. The moment I chose deliberate silence instead of reflexive silence, everything shifted. And here's what I've learned. If you are the most competent person in the room, but never claim narrative ownership, someone else will. If you absorb blame to maintain harmony, harmony will eventually cost you. And if you document consistently, not out of paranoia, but out of principle, you will never need to shout to be believed. There was no revenge arc in my story, no dramatic speech, no emotional explosion, just a screen, a boardroom, and data that spoke clearly. Sometimes, quiet dominance isn't about overpowering anyone. It's about refusing to disappear. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever watched someone slowly reposition your work as their oversight, if you've ever felt that familiar tightening in your chest when blame starts drifting toward you because you're the steady one, I'm curious, would you have confronted him privately? Or would you have done exactly what I did, waited for the room where truth couldn't be ignored? Tell me in the comments.
Cảm ơn bạn đã lắng nghe câu chuyện vừa rồi. Đừng quên like, share và bấm chuông để không bỏ lỡ câu chuyện mới nhất. Hẹn gặp lại.